Okay, so we're back with another episode. This time joining me is Quinn Henoch, and we will be talking about mobility, stability, as well as a subject that's I think Quinn is most well known for, which is Ebola.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think I would love to start off with you introducing yourself, and we'll pick it up from there.
Perfect. Well, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. I am a physical therapist in the United States. I have an office inside of a weightlifting gym and weightlifting specific to the sport of weightlifting, snatch and clean and jerk. And that is in Southern California, just south of Los Angeles. I've been a physical therapist for 7 years now. And before that, I originally went to school to be a strength and conditioning coach. And so just try to spend the last several years integrating those two worlds of sports medicine and rehab and strength and conditioning and performance. And, that's the lens at which I look at the athletes and the clients that I see. And played American football in college before that or during undergrad, and have competed in the sport of weightlifting specifically for the past 10 years or so. So just trying to take my experience as a mediocre athlete and physical therapist and strength conditioning coach, and hopefully help the people that I'm working with.
I think that mediocre athletes usually turn out to be the best coaches, so I think that's a good point there.
Yeah, they know what the struggle feels like.
Yeah, I can definitely relate. Okay, so I think that with that out of the way, I'd love to start off with the definitions of how you would you define mobility and the same for stability.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that right up front because it's always good to define terms. And mobility is a tough one because there's not a consensus on the definition. And in fact, there's probably more argument over that than there is any type of consensus, especially with social media. So if you just look at in the health professional lens, mobility is like your ability to walk, your ability to move around in bed. If we go into the hospital and we check a medical professional's notes, they're going to say bed mobility. This person is able to roll around, sit up, walk around, walk to the bathroom, go up and down the stairs. So mobility is very much from a activities of daily living, daily function status. And when you start to get into what the mainstream, I think in our fields refer to as mobility, it starts to get a whole lot more nebulous. Because does mobility mean paths of range of motion? Is it referring to joints? Is it referring to muscles, or all of the above? Is it referring to active movement, your ability to move under load, no load? So to be completely honest, I don't actually know how to define the term. But the way that I try to just anchor a discussion is it's your potential for movement. So mobility is, do you have the requisite range of motion of the joint systems? And joint systems encompasses the bones, obviously, but also the muscles and the connective tissues. And so if I put you on my treatment table and I move your hips around and all is well, the hips are not significantly deviating from the norm. But yet when you squat, you look like a baby giraffe. It looks like you're very quote unquote inflexible. I would say, well, you have the range of motion, you have the requisite. I honestly don't even use the word mobility, and it's on the cover of my book because it's a buzzword in SEO, and it sells. And then I talk about, yeah, exactly. And then I talk about this very thing in the book, whereas like I don't actually know how to define this term. But you have the requisite range of motion. You have the potential for this movement. What you don't have is what we'll then talk about, the coordinative action, perhaps the strength, perhaps the knowledge of the task, that type of thing. So I look at mobility as kind of potential for movement under progressive constraints, load, volume, fatigue, speed, those types of things. And whether you can express that potential or that requisite range of motion that you have under those performance constraints is a different conversation. So this is the trouble that people run into when they say, I don't have the mobility Well, I say, well, when do you run into problems? Well, they're like 90% of my run at max. I say, okay, so you have the mobility all the way up until it gets relatively heavy, and then all of a sudden you don't. And they're like, yeah. It's like, okay, well, you have the range of motion for light weights, then you have the range of motion for the heavy weights. What you don't have are the performance qualities to continue that. So that's where we get into this notion of stability, which is just one facet of a performance constraint. Stability is defined more so in the literature, and the commonality of all the definitions will be stability is the system's ability to offset change. So you think about that, any system, biological, economic, stability is the system's ability to offset change or perturbation, as you'll see that word used quite a bit. So in weightlifting or in strength training, it could be literal forces. So the external load on the bar is trying to pull you out of position. What is your system's ability to offset that and maintain the positions that you want? That could be more, and then we stack more load and more load and more load. We're trying to destabilize the system. So how stable is your system to offset that? Or we're trying to move really fast. Well, the faster that you move, sometimes the crazier and more unstable movement patterns get. And so we say, well, speed has destabilized the system. And that's kind of a global definition, but you can whittle it down to a joint approach, if you want. It's just that movements are complex and they usually use multi-joint systems. And so it's a coordination of the systems when you're talking about stability. So I'll stop there and see if you have any follow-ups or questions on that.
Yeah, I was just about to ask if you don't think that the example of the runner, it's not that the speed that disrupted his stability, but the speed disrupted his coordination, which eventually disrupted stability.
Yeah, exactly. So stability is this umbrella term. And then what goes underneath it is the quality that you care about. So in this case, it's okay, coordination of the running pattern, but why? And let's say it's a runner who doesn't, their coordination patterns don't destabilize until kilometer 10. Okay, well, so now we have a capacity problem. They're going to maybe blame it on their tight hamstrings because they feel their hamstrings tighten up at kilometer 10 because they're fatigued. But it's not a hamstring problem. It's a fitness problem. It's a capacity problem. They had the hamstring length for kilometers 9.9 to 0. So the length is not the problem. So that's how you can, the reason that's important is because people will start chasing the wrong issues. They'll start intervening on the wrong things and they'll wonder why there's no transfer. So for that running example, somebody who starts then just passively stretching their hamstrings because they feel hamstring tightness at kilometer 10. Well, passively stretching your hamstrings is not going to provide the quality that you need at kilometer 10. What we need to do is look at your training load and improve your fitness. And there's a million, we won't get into running programming because I'm definitely not the guy to talk about that, but it's just kind of understanding really what to rule out as a rate limiting problem. And that's where I think mobility and stability it's a fine mental model to start with. You can just ask yourself, do I have the requisite range of motion at rest, at non-fatigued, non-stressful, low load states? And if the answer is yes, then you can tick that box off. And then as you progress in whatever performance aspect you're looking at, be it mileage or load on the bar, and if things start to break down, then you can think about what other qualities don't I have to be able to sustain this. If you can't get into the positions in the first place, by all means, address range of motion and mobility as a rate limiter, as one of the limiting factors right from the jump. It's just that I think more people have the requisite range of motion than think they do. They start chasing ghosts, as I like to call it. And they are not getting transfer from that.
Mm-hmm. I definitely agree with you on that. And I think that people have become very dichotomous in their way of thinking, is that they have to chase that mobility or any other trait that they might think that is the limiting factor. But I wanted to ask you if you think that if one of these qualities suffers, it renders the other, I wouldn't say completely invaluable, but definitely make it less valuable of a trait. I'll give you an example. If you have a weightlifter who has perfect positioning, he can squat deep with the in the overhead position, but he's not stable enough to actually hold the bar when he needs to receive it. His mobility is really, it doesn't really mean anything when we talk about the sport of weightlifting, since he doesn't have the requisite stability as well.
Yeah, no, I think that definitely is a good point. It's still like you raise a good point of like, we make these things dichotomous, but they're not really ever dichotomous. It's always a dynamic interaction. But it's nice if somebody has a requisite range of motion. So being unstable under the bar is you just have to practice. I mean, we don't have to overcomplicate it by saying like you lack stability in this part of your body. You can just say you suck at this because you're new at it. And here are some variations and drills that I want you to practice to get better at it. And here are some cues that I want you to focus on while you're doing these exercises. And that's taking care of the problems. So these terms I use, like we'll have these conversations because we're coach to coach, mobility, stability. But when it comes to the actual athlete, it's just skill acquisition. We can call it we call it instability, but they don't have a stable skill set within that. And we can get into dynamical systems and attractor states, which I don't think we need to, but it's nice when somebody has the requisite range of motion. When I can tick that box off, it's one less thing that I have to worry about. So I don't want to say that it's rendered useless, because at least you have that. If somebody doesn't have that and they're super wobbly and loosey-goosey and quote unquote unstable, we've got a lot to work on. We probably need to get the bar from over your head and start working on some basics before we start, snatching. But if they do have the requisite range of motion, a lot of times we have a higher point of entry, I guess is one way to look at it. When you can tick that box off, you might be able to start a couple steps ahead of the person who doesn't, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that we've been through enough of the conversation to start pissing people off. And because my next question is, how do you think that these words became sort of buzzwords in the fitness community, especially when we talk about mobility, kind of like functional fitness? It started to sort of mean both everything and nothing at the same time. And I also want to address a part of the conversation I had with Nick Licamelli, where we said that usually these fads, or however you want to call them, are just very convenient to sell to the people. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Nick's my guy, by the way. I love Nick. I will do less ranting, because I think just like movement is good for people. Like most people are not hitting the minimum physical activity guidelines. And so if it's a question of just sitting on the couch for 12 hours a day and doing absolutely nothing versus going and doing some static stretching and foam rolling and stuff that's probably not really doing a whole lot, but is still like more movement than they were getting before, I'm all for that. So I just want to throw that out there. But I think things that are easier, both physically to perform and also mentally easier to conceptualize, tend to catch on. Then when you have very charismatic people on the internet who are very good at kind of selling their ideas, and these ideas are easy to do physically and easy to conceptualize mentally, now you have kind of this perfect storm for things catching on. So, you know, I'm not going to name names or systems, but we rewind to like 2010-ish. We've got a couple popular entities who are kind of branding mobility just as a concept. And people want to improve their performance, right? But like, we're human and we want to do it in the easiest way possible. So if somebody is going to promise us faster times, higher jumps, better recovery, less injuries, more weight on the bar by just laying on a foam roller for a few minutes a day, like, damn right, I'm going to do that. That's way easier than like training really hard and feeling kind of beat up, you know? So I think there's a combination of those factors, and probably many, that things catch on because they're easier to catch on. And then it's just momentum, man. When something goes viral like that, it really just permeates all facets of the community. And then it's very difficult to pull that out. It's like trying to siphon out the water in a bucket full of gravel and sand. You know, it's just, there's going to be little pockets of water that you miss. It's really, really difficult to bring it back to the middle, because it doesn't need to go all the way back. Like, I'm not going to say that static stretching doesn't do anything, because it does increase range of motion in the short term, but just so does a general active warm up. So my point has always been, what are you getting that just the movement itself, practicing the movement itself won't give you? That's always been my argument. And if I ever say, just throw your foam rollers, just burn them, it's only because I'm like annoyed that day or maybe didn't have enough coffee. But so it's always like a middle. The answer is always in the middle, right? But the middle doesn't sell as well. It's not as sexy. And the people who are espousing the middle aren't as loud, because they kind of like embrace the uncertainty of it all. And they're like, yeah, you know, this definitely could work, but it depends on XYZ, and here's some nuance. And people don't want to hear that. They want to hear absolutes, and they want the blueprint and the recipe, and you know, so I think that all kind of perpetuates it, whether it's the term mobility or the passive modalities in the physical therapy field that just won't die, even though there's just mountains of evidence showing that they're not. You know, therapeutic ultrasound, for example, there's plenty of evidence showing that the effect is the same whether the machine is plugged in or not. So you think about that. So but it's still taught in the curriculums. It's still required by schools to teach. They actually get in trouble if they don't have that in the curriculum. We're talking about doctoral programs. So it's the same type of problem. Old ideas die hard.
It's funny you should mention that. When I tore my labrum in my shoulder, I think the first couple of months, my PT just didn't know what to do with me, because none of the tests didn't show that I have a torn labrum. So he just slapped some of the ultrasound on me, and that's it.
And I'll actually qualify what I said. So some people might interpret what I just said about ultrasound, therapeutic ultrasound, as it doesn't do anything, but that's not correct. So if you plug the machine in and somebody does therapeutic ultrasound on you, or you do it on yourself, it didn't work. Well, so we have to define work. What it does is it heats the tissue. It heats the tissue that's underneath the therapeutic ultrasound head. So if work is that it deep heats the tissue, then it does work. If work is that it heals your tissue at a faster rate, or it decreases your pain or increases your function compared to norms or compared to a control, that's what is questioned. So it always depends on how we are defining work, because stretching works if we're defining work as providing a short-term change in range of motion. Again, my argument is, what other things provide that? Is that specific and special to that particular intervention? And if the answer is no, then you've got to weigh your pros and cons. To me, it's an opportunity cost. If you spend 30 minutes stretching, that's 30 minutes that you could have been spending practicing the movements or practicing the skill of your goals, of your goal activities. You would have gotten probably the same short-term range of motion response, because that's literally what a warm-up does. And you would have gotten the benefit of time efficiency in your workout and more repetitions of the skill. With ultrasound, it's the same thing. Yeah, ultrasound will heat your tissues, but that's 15 minutes that you spend just sitting there with an ultrasound and gel on your leg when you could just jump on the exercise bike, or you could just start warming up actively. You get the same tissue response and you reduce the opportunity cost of just sitting there doing nothing. So that's kind of where I stand on a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Now, I want to stray away from the subject of the conversation one more time to give an example of a conversation I had with a colleague of mine. She unfortunately mentioned her friend getting into a car accident, and when I freaked out and asked her if she's okay, she just said, no, she's really flexible. I mean, she's like practically immune to injuries. And I'm like, wait, that doesn't work that way. In any case, I want to move on to what do you think negatively affects? I think I want to start off with mobility, since that's usually the bigger subject, as well as what do you think we can do to improve upon it, because there are a lot of myths surrounding mobility, and the same for stability as well.
I think impatience is one of the qualities that is the prohibitor of making any type of gains, whether it's range of motion. Nobody has range of motion goals by themselves. It's range of motion affords us movement options. So having range of motion allows us to do certain activities. So you know what I mean? It's not that like I want more degrees of ankle dorsiflexion and that's just the goal, just because I want that. No, I want more degrees of ankle dorsiflexion so that I can squat in a position. I can squat in a more upright position because I like to squat and that's my goal. It's not just my ankle, but being impatient with the process of training in general, whether that's tissue specific adaptations, like range of motion changes take time if they're going to happen at all. Connective tissue and bone don't change a whole lot, especially bone after we mature. If you have a certain structure of your hips, a certain structure of your shoulders, where the ball and socket or the kind of golf ball and the tee, if it's in terms of the shoulder, if they're shaped a certain way, that's going to dictate to some degree your movement solutions, your movement repertoire. Not everybody's squat stance looks the same. It's almost like your fingerprints. Everybody's a little different. And that's a lot to do with the morphology of your bones, which aren't really modifiable for the majority of your life. So that right there, we have to just accept that sometimes we're going to move a little bit differently than the unicorn squat that we see on Instagram. And people don't like that and they become impatient. And especially in the weightlifting or strength training community, they start just layering on weight on the bar when they don't have the skill set to be able to accommodate that stress. And they just wonder why either their positions aren't getting better or their range of motion is not improving. Is because they're trying to do too much too soon. You have to slow cook skill acquisition. We don't learn, like if I'm trying to learn math, don't dump me in a quantum physics or, a calculus class because I don't even know simple division. Meet me where I am. And that's any skills. That's running, that's training itself, it's weightlifting, it's whatever. So dropping the ego and being more patient without any tricks or magic is going to be the first and foremost. The training is a process. And within that, it can be very what you need to increase range of motion can be very tedious, painstaking work that doesn't come with a whole lot of tangible success in the short term, like load on the bar, for example. So if somebody's trying to improve their ankle range of motion in a squat, something like that, a lot of times what we'll do is a light to moderately loaded goblet squat at a really slow tempo in both directions. And I'm like right there in their face. And as soon as they go down in their squat and their butt starts to shoot back and they're, stop using their ankles, I say, no, pause, pull your hips back underneath you, use your ankles, drive your knees forward, keeping their feet flat. But they're sweating their butt off with like light loads after 3 reps. And it's like, wow, that's a lot of work. And I'm like, yeah, so we need to do this focused, deliberate practice for the next 6 months and see where we're at. Like, that's the type of mindset that people need to come into this stuff with. So it's just that I don't think people put enough practice and focus, and we have a lot of egos, and your body will absolutely adapt if you expose it enough more often, and you put it where it's uncomfortable. That's really what it takes. And as far as how to make those changes the best, that example that I just gave is one kind of microcosm of how I would do that. It's load. It's going to your tolerable end range, whatever that is on today. Today your end range is this in the ankles when you squat. Fine. We're going to be there though, and we're going to stay there for a little bit, as opposed to just tugging on them and stretching on them for 10 minutes and then just not thinking about it when we actually do our movements. Deliberately, those goblet squats, split squat with a ankle focus where you're trying to deliberately drive the front knee over the foot, actually using your ankles, foot flat, drive the knee forward, getting an idea of what it feels like to be at end range. Getting to end range and staying there under load and accruing fatigue is how you make changes. We're trying to make changes in shoulder range of motion overhead. You could certainly foam roll your lats. You could do some type of static stretch with a band, something like that. What also you could do is what I call a supine pullover with a little bit of weight. Is you lay on a bench on your back, you slide maybe a 2.5 kilo plate in the middle of the PVC pipe, and you hold the PVC pipe like you'd be holding a bar, and then you slowly raise it over your head in an eccentric manner. So gravity is kind of taking it, but you are in control of that load. So it's an eccentrically loaded stretch. It's an active stretch. And there's a couple papers to support this, where if we can add some load in an eccentric manner to these tissues, we're going to get the same short-term range of motion benefit that we would get from static stretching, but we're probably going to get some architectural changes in the muscles, like fascicle length changes, these types of things that actually lead to changes in range of motion, or at least your ability to control it. A hang from a pull-up bar with your feet up on a box, maybe in front of you, and you're letting gravity pull you down, but that's still active because you are actively not letting your shoulders just fall out of the sockets. Like, you're in control. So I do these forms, and some people would think of them as stretching, but there's an active component to it. And there's a very deliberate focus of kind of butting up against your tolerance threshold and slowly nudging that forward over a long period of time. And what you'll find is that gentle nudge, but always being at that threshold, you do see change over time. It's just slow. And if you want it to be permanent, you have to do it very consistently. So I'll stop there, and we can, move forward.
Yeah, no, I didn't want to stop you there because I think that rant was great. But what I was talking about when I mentioned negatively impacts mobility is when we see a person, for example, doing a squat, and we see them after we haven't seen them, I don't know, half a year or so, and the range of motion is completely different. If we're taking in consideration that there haven't been any serious injuries or anything like that to impact the range of motion.
So the question is, does a long period of time off have a negative effect?
Not necessarily a long period of time off, but in general, any lifestyle choices or anything like that we usually hear on the internet or social media. For example, when people talk about if you're sitting too much, then your hip flexors are shortening and you're losing mobility or whatever, these types of things. Do you think that there are any consequences to our lives as far as mobility goes?
So again, we're kind of using we're throwing out the term mobility, and it's really too nebulous to use in this context, to be completely honest. So I'm just going to say range of motion. I'm going to say, do you have the range of motion for the task that you want to do? What is the task that you want to do? If it's a squat and you don't have, you're unable to get into the positions that you want to get into, is it literally because I lay you on the table and your joints don't go there? Or is it because you don't have the coordination to get there? Those things are not permanent either. So what you're getting at, to your point, is range of motion and stability and coordination and skill are moving targets. They're dynamic. It's not linear. Once you feel like you have something down, doesn't mean it's permanent. So you might feel like you've got your running technique down. It's like all of a sudden it clicks for you. Like it's a really good day. It's like, wow, I think I nailed it. It's very likely that at someday very soon, you're going to feel like you forgot again. It's like, what the heck? I just had this. Sleep can absolutely affect your perception of range of motion and your ability to coordinate. Time off of not doing the thing can absolutely do that, because you're not practicing the skill. You're not exposing your body to the skill. So yes, your range of motion, you can feel like you've lost range of motion because you have not exposed your body to that skill. Nutrition, certainly, anything that can impose a negative stress on the body can affect your perception of how you move. So the reason I go away from mobility is because people are going to be just enamored. It's going to be the interventions they choose that aren't going to transfer. So for this person who has taken a lot of time off and all of a sudden their squat, they've lost significant depth on their squat. If I had to think of what exactly I would do in that scenario, it's probably not lay them on their back and start stretching them. It's probably give them a kettlebell to hold in front of them as a counterbalance, put a box behind their butt, and have them do goblet squats to the box and relearn how to squat again. Their range of motion is going to come back. So if you want to call that mobility, fine. But what you're also doing is you're developing the skills again. So it's mobility, stability, coordination, like all of these things are encompassed. So my recommendation to people is try to find the intervention that's going to give you the most bang for buck. And as coaches and clinicians, we should have regression. We should have variations of movements in our back pocket that we can pull out that are the next most difficult variation that person can perform. That's going to give us what we want. So the example that I just gave is that we can't do just a straight squat. What's a regression to that variation, but is still challenging and will start to give us that range of motion back, that mobility, stability, coordination. I threw out a goblet squat to a box. Some people might have different ideas. Could be a band assisted squat where you're holding a band and you're squatting down, something like that. That's fine. But what probably won't give you a whole lot of benefit is going all the way down to the bottom, laying on your back and just passively stretching your hamstrings. You're going to stand up and your squat is still going to feel like trash. If it's something that you just haven't practiced or you haven't slept over the past week because of work and life and something like that. So you just have to take all these things into account, but you can absolutely lose range of motion. If you don't use it, you lose it. It's a very true idiom. So I don't know if that gets at your question, but.
Yeah, sort of. Now, I wanted to go over the stability route, but change the wording to more of a strength related. So we'll just call it strength. How much impact do you think strength has on someone's range of motion? If we go back to the example of a weightlifter with weight above their head, if you see them snatching, something just doesn't click with their overhead position. They're not getting into the positions properly. But when you test their passive range of motion or anything like that, they go overhead very well. But then if you throw them into something like a prone eye raise or anything like that, where they have to actively actually reach over their head, that's where they actually have the problem. So I'll refer back to the question, how much of the aspect of stability or strength do you think impacts range of motion?
It is a dynamic couple, so it definitely impacts it. My approach would be to keep things as specific as possible. So I may not use I don't know how much transfer a prone eye has as a test. Like if they literally can't lift their arm off the table, I mean, yeah, that's something. We might do dumbbell overhead presses, or we might put a 5 kilo training bar over their head. So if they're holding a 20 kilo bar over their head and it looks super wobbly and they can't control it, this is going to sound overly simplistic, but I think simple does it in a lot of cases is we can just use a lighter bar. That can be my assessment. And we can use a bar, we can use a lighter bar and a lighter bar and a lighter bar until they're able to hold the position that I want. And then as they squat down, if they start to lose that position in the shoulders, then I afford them a different constraint. So we might use a box to sit at, just at the point in the range of motion where they start to lose it. So we found a load that they can stabilize overhead. We've found a depth that's just at their threshold, and we practice and we get our reps in there. So the next few sessions might be that exact weight on the training bar and that exact box of that height on that box. And when I feel as a coach and they feel comfortable now with those constraints, well, how would we progress? We'd probably pick one of those options and progress it. I don't think one's right or wrong, but you could use a heavier bar. You could use a lower box. So the reason I'm not just going off of these terms of strength is because what does strength mean? Strength is your ability to produce force, but force is only relevant in the particular pattern that we're talking about. And so I find it useful to bring it back to a specific activity. Many times we use strength, we use this athlete is strong or this athlete is powerful as an ontological quality, as in they are just that. They are just a strong person if they have a strong squat, for example. But that very same athlete could have a very strong squat and look very weak in another movement because that skill and task is completely different. So I like to bring it back to the specific goal activity. Can you produce the requisite amount of force in that goal activity? If the answer is no, let's find where you can produce enough force. So in this case, it's a lighter bar. And then the progression of building their strength in that specific activity and position is pretty simple. It's just progressive overload over time. And whatever position looks good for you is definitely up to the discretion of the coach. And I think that's where a lot of the debate will come. That will never end, by the way, because I could look at somebody's overhead squat and say, yeah, that's adequate to me. I would be comfortable adding load to that. And another coach might say, heck no, I'm not comfortable adding load to that position until I see X, Y, Z. So those are always the conversations that are going to be had. But with qualities like strength and balance and stability and coordination are a lot easier to have if we're talking about a very specific quality. And then how would we progress or regress that activity, modify it so that the person can work on that specific quality in the context of the activity itself. Once you have that, then all these accessory movements, I's, Y's, T's, dumbbell overhead press, all this stuff that's non-specific to the task, but still builds like general qualities like muscle mass or just general force production through the shoulder, stuff like that. That stuff is fantastic. It's just that if you start there, if you give them all this non-specific stuff and just hope that it has this magic transfer to the complex skill that they're trying to get better at, it doesn't work as well.
Okay, I got you. That you're looking like you're not sure if that was clear or not.
Well, I'm never sure if what I say is clear, but
no,
I'm not purposely sidestepping your question. It's just that there are there's steps to go back. When we talk about these specific terms, we really need to just know what we're talking about.
Yeah, of course.
At the ground level.
I like it that you're trying to keep it completely simple and specific to the task at hand. Now, I wanted to finish off the episode with the conversation about Nivola, as I mentioned, which is a hashtag that you popularized. Where do you think that the myth behind knee first squats came in? I know that people talk about the knees over your toes and where it came from, but what do you think that the reasoning behind not squatting with your knees first?
Okay. So just to explain the Nivola thing, it's just a joke to say when we're squatting, hey, look, my knees are going over my toes, I'm going to get Nivola. So it's just a funny, sarcastic thing that kind of caught on. But it's a similar conversation probably of how certain buzzwords and terms come to popularity. There's some truth to certain aspects. So the myth is that, or the thought is that if you let your knees come forward when you squat, or you let your shins come forward, you let your knees come over your toes or even past your toes, that it's bad for your knees. So it's this dichotomy, good, bad. Don't do that, it's bad. Keep your knees back and your shins vertical, that's good. So that's a myth, but there's nuance to it. It is true that if you let your knees come forward, you are putting more of a torque demand through the knee joint. You are putting more force through your knees. I mean, you can feel that. Just do a squat off your heels, like just on the balls of your feet, and let your knees go as far past your feet as you possibly can. You feel it in your quads and you feel it in your knees. You don't feel a whole lot in your glutes and back because the forces and the torques are distributed forward anteriorly. If, in contrast, you do kind of a pancake squat, a good morning squat, where you shift your butt as far back as you can and your shins are completely vertical, you feel it more in your glutes and your lower back, just because you're shifting forces. And force and position is amoral. There's no good or bad that comes with this stuff. It's whatever you feel is going to transfer to whatever you want to do. So a power lifter, their goal is to squat as much weight as humanly possible. And they're going to use the strategy that allows that to happen. And that's usually a lower bar position, a more forward trunk, hips slightly more back, less knees coming forward, because that just allows you to leverage your big muscles, your big back muscles and your big hip and hamstrings to drive that weight up, because that's the goal. In the sport of weightlifting, where you want to be very upright to receive a clean or a snatch, a tipped forward squat is probably going to make you dump the weight. It's going to make you miss the lift. So you would use a different squatting strategy. You'd use a higher bar position, a more upright torso, and naturally your knees are going to be more forward in that squat, because that's what transfers to the goal task. It does put more load on your knees. That's neither good nor bad. It's just the nature of training. We train to put load on our bodies. So for those that say, well, don't put force on your knees, it's bad. Well, you probably shouldn't get out of bed in the morning. Don't go up and down those stairs then. So that argument doesn't make any sense to me, because it's like we're these fragile pieces of glass. And I think that just perpetuates a lot of unnecessary fear in people. So that's number one. Number two is try to go up and down stairs, or try to jump, or do anything semi-athletic with a completely vertical shin, not allowing your knees to come forward at all. And you'll find very, very soon that it's not natural. We have ankles for a reason. And anybody listening with a fused ankle, like let's say they've had a surgery and they have metal plates in their ankle's never going to move again. They know, because they'll say, yeah, I wish my knees could come forward, because it changes your movement solution. So I think it's a myth, just because there's been some, laboratory research showing that a knees forward position puts more load on the knees. And then people make this erroneous assumption that that's bad. So that's number one. Number two is, when our knees do hurt, putting more force into them sometimes makes them hurt more because they're already hurt. So yeah, if you load them up, like that's probably going to trigger your symptoms. And so in your mind, you think, oh, that's what caused it. Was this position. This position makes my pain worse. That means that position is bad all around forever. And again, you're making these leaps. But so I think it's a combination of those things that have just, again, perpetuated themselves over time. But it's really just pick your poison. The force has to go somewhere. So if you don't want it to go into your knees, well, guess what? You're going to shift it into your back and your hips. So I could make the same scare. I could do the same scare tactics. Well, you're going to hurt your back. So like, what do you want to do? You know, just lay in bed. But yeah, so end rant, and then I'll let you follow it up.
Yeah. Now, following that, I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on I think one of the most popular arguments that I've heard against the knee first squats, at least in my experience, is that the role of the hamstrings when you squat is to stabilize or to quote unquote hold the positional structure of the knee in a safer position when co-contracting with the quads. I think it just sounds like a bunch of jibber jabber somebody just made up, but that's me.
Yeah, the hamstrings don't play a huge role in the squat, actually. If you go, there's a Greg Nuckols, Stronger by Science, did a really comprehensive blog on that, and you can just Google that, Greg Nuckols, hamstrings in the squat, it'll pop right up. But people will blame the hamstrings on a lot of stuff. You know, they'll blame the hamstrings on the lower back flexion, kind of what people call butt wink. But your hamstrings, you know, they're being shortened when you squat down at the knee. They're being lengthened at the hip because your hip is flexing, but they're being shortened at the knee. So it's really kind of a wash. It's dangerous to think of muscles as the linchpin in isolation when it comes to complex movements, like a squat, for example, because there's a lot of movements, there's a lot of muscles involved, and there's not one muscle that's necessarily not just not changing length, and it's just like co-contracting. No, your muscles are changing length in various degrees as you're going down and as you're standing up. So it's just this dynamic action of contract, stretch, you know, eccentric, concentric, but while maintaining some type of synergy. So I guess my rebuttal to that thing would be like, well, what are you going to do about that? Just either not squat or strengthen your hamstrings. I guess I just don't even know where to start. When it comes to that question, I would probably just start with what I had mentioned before, is what regression of the squat can you do that is up to the standards of the coach? And then you just trust that all the muscles that are supposed to be working are working. If the person's not had any type of neurological injury, your hamstrings are going to work as much as they need to work, and so are your quads. Oh, just hinge first? Okay.
Yeah, I was just typing in that usually the argument behind, so what do you do, is just hinge first. That will fix your. It's funny to me, since the positioning at end range and every other aspect of the squat is exactly the same. But somehow, if you magically hinge first instead of bringing your knees forward first, or God forbid, do them simultaneously, somehow that's sort of a magical position.
Yeah, I just kind of let people explore, because like you said, the rest of the squat's going to be pretty much the same from a position standpoint, regardless of how you start. But some people, if they say, look, I just feel a little bit more comfortable when I kind of preload the hamstrings into a little bit of a shift backwards like that, and then I watch them squat and it ends up like the end product is A-okay, and it's what I think will transfer over to what we want, I'm okay with it. If another person says, I like to literally think about pushing my knees forward to start my squat, and I watch their squat and it just looks like they sit down and stand up and it looks pretty darn good, that's the cue that works for them. So it's again, getting away from these dichotomies, getting away from the dogma of good, bad, do it like this. How about you just, as coaches and clinicians, how about we just give the person a few options and let them explore the movement themselves? Me personally, personally, a good example is when I don't wear a weightlifting belt, which is usually the case when I'm not wearing a weightlifting belt and I'm doing back squats. I actually feel just more comfortable through my back and hips if I push back just a little bit. It just feels like I'm being less compressed by the bar to start my squat. If I just kind of push back into my hips first, but I still just then sit straight down. My knees come forward naturally, but it's just that initial starting point. But I'm not thinking muscles. I've just learned over time, this feels more comfortable to start. But when I have a belt on, it just creates so much pressure and my trunk just feels so strong and rock solid. I can just sit straight down and just pop right out of the bottom of the squat. So it's like different. I don't have to kind of baby that initial position. This is just something I've learned about myself, but I'm not coming in with the narrative of I'm doing it because hamstrings or I'm doing it because one is better than the other. I've just explored, I've experimented, and that seems to be the pattern with me. Other people could be completely opposite. So like I said, I think we should look at the end goal. What's the outcome of the movement? If the outcome is the movement is adequate for us as the coach and adequate for the person, there are a lot of different strategies to get there. And the hinge back, it's just kind of, we could rebuttal it with the same points that we made before. So you do a good morning squat because you don't want to hurt your knees. So you basically just shift the load into your back and your hips. So if you think load is bad, then you must want them to hurt their back and their hips. And they'll say, no. It's just that those muscles and joints are stronger. I'll say, okay, so you want their knees to continue to be weak. Like, why would we want to deload a structure just continuously? That's the opposite of adaptation and training, right? We would want to pick appropriate progressive overload so that they are resilient and can tolerate many different positions. And if you're working with athletes, that should be your job, because an athlete is go on the soccer pitch, go on the American football field, go on the basketball court. You're going to see a lot of flexed spines, forward knees, inward knees, a lot of positions that don't look super great just from a training standpoint, but they are going to be exposed to these positions. So as strength and conditioning coaches and healthcare professionals, we shouldn't be afraid of putting forces through our bodies necessarily, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that list comprises of some of the biggest nightmares for some coaches to hear.
Yeah. Now there's probably a ceiling to that. Like there's a limit. So I'm not of the camp that I just have my athletes, because they're going to be in knee valgus on the pitch or on the American football field or basketball court, because that's going to happen. They're going to be in knee valgus when they're cutting, landing, they're just going to happen. I am not necessarily of the camp where I'm putting them in valgus purposely and repeatedly under heavy loads and fast motions in the gym. But I allow them to explore positions that feel strong for them. I don't put them in a box at the same time. So I think there's a middle ground where you can take advantage of progressive overload in positions that are probably going to most accommodate those, like progressive overload, but I'm not so restricting them into a little movement box that they're going to be very unprepared to go out onto the pitch when they're being exposed to all different kinds of positions. And if I had to choose, I get where the camp says, yeah, I train my athletes into valgus because that's where they're going to be exposed to on the field. Like, I get the argument. I just don't know how much we can really progressively overload those positions. So it comes back to kind of that opportunity cost, bang for buck, when we only have a limited amount of time with the athletes. That's just probably a different conversation, but I'm much more of the camp of let the athlete explore positions, explore their movement solutions. I'm a guide, I'm a tour guide. So I kind of nudge them in directions that I think is going to give them the best bang for buck and most probability for success, but I'm not a dictator. I'm not the arbiter of good and bad movement.
Hmm. I think that after I've seen one of Greg Lehman's trainees, Jefferson curl 200 kilos for reps, it
Right.
kind of it kind of changed my perspective of what I think that we can load a a, a flex spine.
So that's a really good example because we are adaptable creatures. And I think people forget that. At the same time, you have to ask yourself, what is the opportunity cost? What is the amount of time and effort that I have to put into getting a 200-pound Jefferson curl? And what is that going to afford me?
200 kilo
200-kilo Jefferson curl. Okay, well, that's impressive.
for reps. Yeah.
Okay, I haven't seen that video. But it's the same question. So is it to make a statement, or do I think that 200-kilo Jefferson curl is going to transfer to what I care about? Because nobody competes in the Jefferson curl. Gymnasts use the Jefferson curl because they are in extreme positions and they need resiliency and strength at length. Other athletes don't necessarily need those extreme positions. And so if I were going to make it a goal for my American football player to have a 100-kilo Jefferson curl, well, that's probably going to be a lot of time and recovery resources devoted to that. That's going to have some questionable transfer to the stuff they care about, where I could just stick to the basics of strength and conditioning and get them to be brutally strong and jump high and run really fast and be super muscly and mean. So but I think that example of of that is a good example that we are adaptable. So then it's a conversation of, do I want that adaptation versus, oh, that's good or bad? And that's important. That's an important distinction. I think Greg has been great in pushing that conversation forward.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so with that, I want to wrap up the episode. And if you want to mention any upcoming projects that you or Clinical Athlete have, obviously you still have the CalU replays available. But anything else that you would like to mention?
Yeah, I think, well, we've got lots of stuff in the works, but because I don't know, when they're going to be out in relation to this episode, I would just say, if you want to stay up to date on stuff we got going on, you can follow me on Facebook, Quinn Henoch, on Instagram, Quinn.Henoch DPT, on Clinical Athlete Instagram, Clinical Athlete Facebook, Clinical Athlete website, clinicalathlete.com. We've got the Clinical Athlete directory where if an athlete needs somebody to help them out that they can trust is going to understand their performance goals, they can go on the website and find somebody in their area or somebody to reach out to. So you just stay attuned to those platforms and you'll get plenty of updates.
Okay, cool. So thanks a lot for your time. And I hope to do this again one day.
Yeah, I appreciate you.